Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by Henry Jackman. On today's episode, we will focus on Henry's fantastic work on the films Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, and Jumanji, The Next Level. Welcome back, Henry.
Hey, well, thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you back, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to me again.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And Henry, you are certainly no stranger when it comes to action scoring, either creating a big orchestral score or mixing it with electronics. And for Jumanji, the sequel to the 1996 hit movie, you basically kept things orchestral with a big theme and large cues. Please tell me a bit about the writing process and why you decided not to do hybrid score.
Well, it's a very good question. I've always loved, as a sort of guilty pleasure, well, not even a guilty pleasure, they're just great scores. When you think of movies, and I shouldn't really compare myself to these sort of movies because they're all John Williams, but, you know, when you're my age, you remember clearly scores for E.T. and Back to the Future, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and good James Horner scores like the original 90s Jumanji, and some people might even remember Willow. But my point being, these are all action-adventure symphonic scores that actually formed an important part of my childhood. And given that a lot of film scoring and indeed filmmaking has changed a lot, there isn't often an opportunity to write a symphonic and orchestral score that owes its ancestry to Alan Silvestri and James Horner and John Williams and Jerry, all these, you know, great, much better composers than me from the past. And I thought, and especially the director of the new Jumanji films, Jake Kasdan, he was also a great fan of those kind of orchestral, committed, thematic scores. So given that I've done a lot of other hybrid and, you know, various other things, it just seemed like a really good opportunity to celebrate that kind of symphonic and orchestral approach and not try to do like a remix or make it a hybrid or anything like that. Because apart from anything else, as a composer, you don't often get the chance. There aren't that many types of movie because it depends on the filmmaking. The actual style of movie of Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, Next Level, even the style of the filmmaking, you know, there's a sort of family-friendly and there's a sort of innocence and a celebration of fun and adventure that I can't think of many other modern franchises that have that. I mean, the Marvel universe has that to some extent, but it's different. It's a different tone. So that was the idea to, if you listen on the Welcome to the Jungle CD, I think the first track's called Jumanji Overture, you know, and that was my idea of just write a piece with all these kind of grand and committed themes in it and let that be the basis of this symphonic and thematic approach to the movie. And I think it suited the director and the film pretty well.
You just mentioned the overture for Jumanji. Did you at first assemble an even bigger, or did you at first compose an even bigger overture and Mr. Kasdan pick the themes you liked best?
Let's see, I'm trying to remember when I think I probably had a few, yes, I probably had written more themes on the piano, some of which just weren't good enough. And then when it came to the overture, I just set out all the themes, well, not all of them, I set out the themes that were consistent for both movies. You know, there's quite a few people listening, anyone listening to that will notice, you know, one or two or three different ideas in there. And then when it actually came to the movies, there was additional thematic ideas. For instance, in the latest movie, Jumanji Next Level, you know, there was a character called Jürgen the Brutal. So that was a whole new stream of DNA. Well, I actually had a bit of fun with it. Again, in the same spirit of being symphonic and thematic, I decided to go for a very kind of classical, kind of slightly Wagnerian approach for Jürgen the Brutal, because he seemed like such a sort of fantastically overblown adversary, and he was a sort of cross between a medieval warlord and a slightly Teutonic dictator. So it was a a bit of an invitation to, again, you know, celebrate the most overblown and pompous Wagnerian approach to it all. But yeah, I would say that the Jumanji Overture contains, you know, about 50% of the overall adventurous thematic material that actually ended up working in both films. But the other thing that happens is in the second film, you end up reharmonizing, recontextualizing, reorchestrating, just finding different approaches to some of the same thematic material, which is an interesting challenge.
The 90s movie starring Robin Williams is a big nostalgic film for me personally, and also in terms of the score which James Horner had written. Would you share this sentiment? Do you also feel nostalgic when you watch the movie, and did this kind of also inspire you, or did it in some way help you to tackle this project, the sequel?
Well, funnily enough, because of my age, I fall right in between. By the time that movie came out, I was probably a bit too cool for school and watching slightly different kind of movies. My ultimate nostalgia movies were more like War Games, E.T., probably more like mid-late 80s. By the time the original Jumanji film came out, I was probably, you know, thinking I was super cool watching like David Cronenberg and, you know, Dead Ringers and The Fly and all kinds of things like that. However, having said that, I was very aware, not so much specifically of themes or anything, but that style of music, the original score of James Horner, you know, I very much had that lineage of adventure score sort of knocking around the back of my head. So whilst the actual mechanics of the movie and the reminiscence and the nostalgia wasn't as high as something like E.T. or Empire Strikes Back, the overall musical tone of it was something that was definitely lingering, without being specific. You know, it's a sort of language, it's a vocabulary that I really wanted to hark back to, not in a dissimilar way to when I did the more recent Predator score. Yep. I was really keen to make sure that I still had, and in fact, I even quoted some of Alan's original themes, and that was, I mean, it's a much scarier tone because it has a very atone, well, not atonal, it has like an octatonic language in the harmony. But in the same way that in the Predator score, I wanted to pay homage to the sort of harmonic language that Alan established in the 80s. It was a similar thing with these Jumanji films. I really wanted to make the style of score something that would be recognizable from that period of filmmaking where James Horner and, you know, James Newton Howard and John Williams, that's sort of a score. And whilst, you know, I'm not claiming I'm as good as those guys, but it's more like, you know, it was an influence of the type of score.
Jake Kasdan not only directed the picture, but he also wrote the screenplay. And did he at some point hand you the script in order to ask you to come up with some ideas as quickly as possible?
Yes. Well, let me see. I'm trying to think of the order of play. I think for the first movie, Welcome to the Jungle, I think I may have started writing themes before I even saw any footage, which is sometimes a good idea, sometimes not a good idea, because it depends on the visual language of the director. Because, you know, you can gain a hell of a lot from a script, but then depending on, you know, if you give a script to 5 different directors, you're going to get 5 very different movies. They might even be totally different. But because we'd been engaged in conversation about this whole thing we've just been discussing to do with some of these scores from the past, like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Empire Strikes Back, because we'd had those conversations, I think I started to write the themes and the overture before I'd seen any footage, just to sort of, you know, give myself enough time to spend on working through the themes. So yeah, I believe the original Jumanji Overture was written before I saw footage. And then once I got a first cut of the movie, that's when I figured out the other thematic material that was needed, like for Van Pelt in the first movie and for Jürgen the Brutal in the second film. And of course, once you start writing the cues for the movie, you take some of these ideas you've got and then they start getting contextualized into the film. And that's when you start really thinking about your orchestration and the color and the, variations and permutations and different orchestrations.
And Henry, having a big thematic orchestral score is not a given these days anymore. And if you're lucky enough to work with a filmmaker that actually celebrates this type of score of grand Hollywood tradition, does this make you say, yeah, I'm super excited to be writing this, and also perhaps to regard this as a challenge to remind a younger audience how magical the process actually can be or should be?
That's a very good question, because I'm not saying anything against Netflix or Amazon Prime or anything, but I would say that the days of ending up in either London or Los Angeles with 6 days with a huge symphony orchestra, but by the time you add it up, if you include choir and percussion, all the rest of it, a potential 140, 150 human beings involved in this thing. It's something that, increasingly is less likely to happen, both for filmmaking reasons, as a lot of times a score doesn't need that. It's something smaller or more intimate or more unusual or surrealistic or electronic, or there's lots of reasons why you don't need a huge orchestra. But unfortunately, one of the additional reasons these days is that, people, there aren't, the only people left who can afford to pay for all the sessions required for a big adventure film are, the big studios, and even they do less of those kind of films. So yeah, what you should celebrate. I certainly feel very grateful, when you end up at the scoring stage with basically America's finest musicians, for that many days and that many sessions, and everything's being recorded respectfully and no samples are being used. I wonder how many more years that will be the case. I mean, just to give you an example, I can't remember the name of the key. There's a track on Next Level called Beyond the Clouds, and right at the end of that, it's one of my favorite cues, actually, that one. But right at the end of that, there's a little trumpet solo and a horn solo. And, right now there are shows on Amazon Prime and Netflix where, potentially some brass might even be samples. Well, the guy playing the trumpet solo at the end of that cue is the lead trumpet player of the LA Philharmonic. And, it's one thing to write it and I program up all the demos, and it sounds okay. And then he played this, when this guy played it, he's one of the best trumpet players in the world. So it just sounds absolutely magical. And, I guess I'm just throwing out a reminder to everyone that we got to be careful, and that certain things can only be achieved when you actually hire some of the world's best orchestras. A hell of a lot can be achieved without that, obviously. But for certain projects, it's really important that we hold on to, the tradition of recording a full symphony orchestra and not cutting any corners, which is exactly what happened on Jumanji. Everything was recorded for real. All the percussion, all the celeste, all the choir, everything. Literally everything was just, the best players you can think of. And that is a great privilege.
Welcome to the Jungle and also the Next Level. Did you prefer to have the full orchestra play on each session, or did you opt to record certain sections individually to get a better mix? What do you actually prefer?
For a score like that, it's best to get as many, if for something like, I don't know, Fifth Wave or X-Men First Class, I ended up doing the strings and woodwinds separately to the brass. With Jumanji, I try to get that kind of thing's so much better if you record it all at the same time. I mean, apart from anything else, when a score is symphonic, everyone's reacting. All the players are reacting to one another. So the brass tuning and their phrasing and their ensemble is completely affected by the fact that they're hearing all the strings and woodwinds around them. In fact, everyone's interacting with one another. The only reason, really, that one ends up separating stuff, it's like a necessary evil. In an ideal world, you'd never do it. But unfortunately, to get some mix control, sometimes it's absolutely necessary. But for a symphonic type of score in the style of the 2 Jumanji scores that I've done, we had everyone in there. The only things that were separate were percussion and choir. And then everything else, we squeezed them all into the Fox scoring stage. And it's just so much better for the players, and because you can't quite expect the same performance. If you're not hearing, I know they have headphones and everything, but if you're hearing everything in the room as a player, it's a different experience. It's more exciting. The ensemble's better, the tuning's better, the spirit of what they're trying to achieve as an orchestra is better understood. So when possible, my vote is to get as many people in the room as possible when it's possible. Obviously, if you have a very electronic score or a hybrid score, that's a different thing, and you may need to do things separately to affect things in the mix, to get mix control, and change the sonority of things. That's I completely understand that, and I do it myself. But not if you're trying to do something thematic and symphonic. Your best bet is to get the best performance in the room you can and the most realistic, and then don't mess with it too much afterwards.
And Henry, when I watched Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle for the first time, I was actually pleasantly surprised. It wasn't an over-the-top action fest, which you might expect these days. It had a little bit of everything, interesting characters, humor, and a well-told story. The second one is a bit larger, I feel, but what did you expect at first when the idea was pitched to you about Jumanji the sequel?
That's a really good question, because I think one of the reasons the Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle got a good score on Rotten Tomatoes, and I remember so many reviews were sort of saying things like pleasantly surprised, because I think when a studio digs up a franchise whose last iteration was a long time ago, I mean, it's been over 20 years, there's a feeling it might just be some cynical operation to extract some, money out of an old franchise and play on the nostalgia. And perhaps they'd be lazy and not really give it too much artistic attention. And, that sometimes happens in Hollywood. But the way it's really down to Jake. When Jake wrote Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle, it's kind of similar to what we've been talking about. He has admiration for some of those family action adventure films that were from a slightly gentler time, like E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so he has, Jake's father, I think I'm right in saying, wrote Empire Strikes Back. You may have to check me on that. I'm pretty sure Jake's father wrote Empire Strikes Back. Anyway, the point being, he spent a long time, and he's a good writer, and it's not lazy. It's a good story. The narrative works. The story has good structure. He spent a long time working on the characters, working on the mechanics of the story so it flows properly. And, he's got a background in comedy as well. So, Jake really did work hard to make sure that when this first Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, the first one after the original, the last thing he wanted was the reviews to say, oh, it's a lazy rehash and it's just all loud action and it's, has no charm. He was really mindful of that. So it's all in the story, which obviously helps me as a composer. He was very keen to make sure, if anything, he wanted to try and surpass. We didn't have Robin Williams, but we did have The Rock. There was a great cast, and we have Jack Black and Kevin Hart, So he was very keen to make sure there was enough warmth and heart and companionship, and not leaning too much just on spectacle and on, visceral attributes. And I think he did a really good job. And what that meant was that then flowed through in the music, and there were opportunities to do emotional cues as well as action cues, And even the second one did get a bit bigger, but I don't think it lost. It still had enough of a twist from the first one, and it had enough of an emotional backdrop as well, so that even when he had I love those huge scenes. That mandrel scene was a great opportunity. That's one of my other favorite cues. There's a cue on the CD called Attack of the Mandrels. That's huge fun to do, and that was a huge set piece, probably bigger than anything in the first movie, but it still had its quiet moments as well. And its smaller, more intimate stories. So I think a lot of the credit for that has to go to Jake.
When developing material for another sequel, in this case Jumanji The Next Level, did you at first revisit some ideas you wrote for the previous one to find out how you might rearrange those, or did you write a new suite featuring new material for The Next Level?
Well, it's a combination of two things. I really wanted to keep it, you know, in the, I mean, we re-recorded it. If you look on the second CD, it's called the Jumanji Suite, and it's a re-recording of the overture. And some of those themes are in Jumanji Next Level. But to give you an example, well, first of all, I already mentioned Jürgen the Brutal was a completely new thing, and that was great fun. But even when I did reach for the Jumanji Adventure themes that appear in that overture, because it's different, if you listen to the music roundabout, you know, when Jack Black is stretching his arms out across these huge sand dunes going, oh, this is a whole new thing. You know, all the harmony changes so that it has a sort of almost Lawrence of Arabia type feel. So the themes are the same, and the curvature of the melody is the same, but a combination of the reharmonization and the use of the orchestra just pushes it in a different direction. So it's kind of more suitable for a giant helicopter shot of, you know, what looks like a sort of Saharan desert. And it was good fun doing things like that, keeping the melodic integrity of some of the material from the original overture, but finding new ways to describe it, you know, that suit the different landscapes of the new film.
Henry, how do you navigate around big sound effects?
Ask them to turn them down. No. Well, the funny thing is, it's actually more tricky when you do a hybrid. One of the other advantages of doing a symphonic type score is it's not full of really industrial banging and hitting, and because a lot of the information and the narrative intention of your music is coming through in melody and harmony and orchestra, and in other words, in sustained material. It's actually easier at the dub stage because it's not fighting. It's not fighting so much. When you do, it's more tricky. I mean, I'm not saying it's better or worse, but, you know, Winter Soldier, for example, was, you know, if you listen to the Winter Soldier track on the Captain America 2 CD, you know, it's really industrial. And so it's a bit more of a challenge at the dub. You can still do it. So really, I think it's fractionally easier when you have a more symphonic score. Having said that, you just have to work hard at the dub. You know, those guys are really talented, and there's always a bit of a tussle at the dub stage to really pick out, well, you know, let's not try and have equal matching of sound effects and music. Sometimes, you know, you have to accept that certain moments are sound effect moments and music will take a backseat. And sometimes music's way more important to get the feeling across, and sound effects should take a backseat. And my big thing with sound effects is not, I really don't like movies where the dub is a constant fight between music and sound effects because they're trying to hold them in some sort of balance that's equal all the way through. I think it's much more important to have more courage and just make more decisions. Like at certain points of the movie, if you decide this really is more realistic and sound effect driven, then go for it and push them, and then let the music take a slight backseat and get the idea across. And then conversely, when it's a more important musical moment, you know, push it the other way around. And, you know, you should be committed about it. I don't really like dubs where you feel like the sound effect and the music are dead even all the time in some endless struggle where no one is ever taking the stage. I just think that's not as courageous. You should be more definitive in your vision of, at any moment, what would you like to hear more of, you know? And eventually, you know, you get there in the end. And I think it was, I thought it was a great mix on Jumanji.
Right. And the standout cue on the second album of you know, Jumanji Next Level to me was Flightless Fury, which is an outstanding action cue. And just to give our audience or also young aspiring composers an example, how much time did you actually spend on writing a massive action cue like that and also synchronizing it to picture?
A long time. Yeah, if the combined time of Flightless Fury and Attack of the Mandrills is probably several weeks, but you're sort of working on them whilst working on other things. But you know, it was, and also Flightless Fury went through a couple of different iterations as we realized we could be more, you know, when I first played it to Jake, he was like, well, this is fantastic, and I love the sort of adventurousness of it. But ironically enough, even though they're sort of ostriches, we could probably actually be a bit more barbaric and atonal and a bit more nasty than you might imagine. So it went through a couple of iterations, which I really enjoyed. You know, he was just encouraging me to celebrate the sort of irony that the setup to the ostriches is that they're quite quirky and inquisitive, but then when they show up, it's almost like it's King Kong showing up. But and the other difficulty you've got is the picture's often changing a lot, you know, as they're working away at it. So it probably 2 or 3 weeks to be the absolutely finished version. But it's not like you're not working on other things at the same time. So, and the thing about that is you mustn't panic about time, because some cues take a day to write, you know, and some take a couple of weeks to go through every iteration, be matched to picture, you know, have the director have enough time to give all his notes about it, the absolutely definitive version. Probably even longer with the Attack of the Mandrills. But yeah, those two in particular take longer. So anyone who's sort of starting out, if they're getting frustrated that they haven't finished a dense, somewhat sophisticated orchestrally, you know, in terms of the orchestration, if they haven't finished a 5-minute symphonic action cue in 2 days, they shouldn't panic. It's perfectly normal.
Henry, I know it's pretty common to fiddle with many scores until the last minute, but when you record the score with the orchestra and you also have the director present, did you in this case also have to make some adjustments on the fly when the director might have said, well, it sounds all good, the playing is fine, but I want a couple of adjustments? Did that happen on the next level perhaps?
That does happen, but funnily enough, in order to present everything to the director prior to scoring, you know, one of the disadvantages of all this technology we have is you can do these incredibly detailed mock-ups that really are, I mean, I drive myself crazy. The mock-ups I do don't have anything vague about it until every single orchestral part is programmed down to oboe 1, oboe 2, you know, flute 1, flute 2. And that is disadvantageous because of the amount of time that takes. But the advantage of it is that Jake hasn't heard an approximation. I mean, he really has heard exactly. I mean, obviously, it's not as good as when it's played. But in terms of the detail, it's not like a map, just a string map or a piano map. He's heard something that's about as good as you can get with technology to sound like the cue. So therefore, it's not too much of a surprise. When Jake gets to the stage, he's really hearing a glorious interpretation from these amazing players of something he's already familiar with and knows well. So in this particular case, he was so familiar with all the cues and they'd all gone into the Avid and he knew what they were, that the great joy of being at the Fox scoring stage was all of the time was spent extracting the best possible performance from the players who are already majestic. And very little time was spent, you know, in any compositional, orchestrational or arrangement, which is a great advantage if you're always pressed for time. So if you're able to spend 99% of that time on talking to the players and getting the best possible performance, you know, it makes the privilege even greater because you're focusing all your time on the interpretation and not on the composition, arrangement or orchestration. So, and that was pretty much the case in this particular film, but it's not always the case, you know. Some directors are less sure about things and change their mind more, but Jake was very familiar with all the cues. And no, he wouldn't. In fact, Jake was also very good at it because it's not just changing music. Jake was so sophisticated musically. He would, like me, also sometimes make some comments actually about the interpretation, you know, not changing the music. He would just sidle up to me and go, hey, I wonder, is there any, I'm loving how it sounds. Is there a more intimate version of this? And I'd be like, yeah, we could, you know, we could do a smaller section, or we could change the dynamic slightly. Let me talk to the players. Let me talk, you know, and he was sophisticated enough to even leave the piece exactly as it is and leave the orchestration and just wonder if there was a slightly different performance and interpretation. And that it's a very lucky position to be in because it means you've managed to finish the score such that the director's happy with it and familiar with it. And then you can really focus on the fine details and not be panicking about whether they just like the actual music or not.
Both Jumanji films which you scored are very entertaining, also fun to watch, marvelous scores. And when writing the music, despite the full force and serious orchestral approach, how tricky do you think is it not to be too serious with the music, to emphasize the fun, also to emphasize the fun aspect of the story, so to speak?
That's a very good question. Well, I think I'm a bit lucky again in that in my sort of earlier years, working with Jeffrey Katzenberg on DreamWorks animation films, and indeed equally lucky working, with John Lasseter on Disney animation films. There's a certain skill set you learn, I mean, I've done, let's see, Monsters vs. Aliens, Puss in Boots, Big Hero 6, Wreck-It Ralph, And so if you've worked on those sorts of films, there's a sort of desire in the filmmaking to make sure that in certain areas that there's a charm and there's a sympathy to everything, not to everything, to certain areas of the film, and that should affect and influence the music. Because funnily enough, when I was a you need so many different skills for music. Because I mean, I spent, in my late teens and early 20s, I was listening mostly just to drum and bass. I like all kinds of different music. I like really brutal. Like I said, if you listen to that Winter Soldier thing, I mean, that is a million miles away from what we're talking about. It's just incredibly brutal piece of music. So, but you have these different skill sets. So I think a combination of knowing Jake, working with Jake, being familiar with the script, seeing the first cut of the film, and also having developed some of that skill set from working on, movies that celebrate fun and charm, like Wreck-It Ralph, that aren't determined to be dark and brutal and moody all the time. It means that, and it's not quite the same as animation. It's a because it's a live action thing. But I think there's probably just a small dosage of influence from the musical world of animation in respect of celebrating and not being scared of fun and charm and entertainment. It's not a rude word, because there's different kinds of filmmaking. For some filmmakers, that would be completely, they're just not in that area, and that's not what they're achieving. So I think, fortunately for me, I've had enough experience in producers and artists and filmmakers who have needed to, especially those Wreck-It Ralph films, they both have serious things in them, and they have charm, and it's similar. Jake has a similar sensibility. So, but you're right, because you can ruin, if it's, it could go both ways. In the comedy parts of Jumanji Next Level, I did very little. I mostly stayed out of the way for Danny DeVito and Danny Glover, because you can go too far. If you put a hat on a hat and you're trying to write silly music over, comedy, it's a disaster. And so you can be too goofy. And then on the other hand, you can suppress the inherent charm and humor and like boisterousness. I don't know what the word is, like almost joie de vivre. But if you're too brooding and if you're too po-faced and take yourself too seriously, you can have, a pernicious effect on allowing, the optimism and the fun to breathe through the movie. So it's a delicate balancing act.
Henry, is there anything else on your mind which you would like to share with me and the audience about Jumanji?
Well, I think you've asked such good questions. I honestly can't think of that. I think you've probably covered everything, I would say.
Right. Thank you very much. And Henry, thank you for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate that. And I loved talking to you. And I hope we get to do many more interviews in the future.
Oh, for sure. It'd be a great pleasure. And the sorts of things I've got coming up next are very much the opposite of what we're discussing now. I've got some, I guess you'd call them more like indie movie and very, very different to the big entertaining blockbuster. And I'm just a great believer that it's a privilege to do all of it. I mean, I'm so lucky because I would neither want to have a career where you only do, indie and quirky things, and I wouldn't want to only do, massive blockbusters. The fact that I've ended up lucky enough in a career to do both is just it's the best thing, and extremely lucky. You know, you should never take it for granted. So yeah, let's have a chat when the things I've got coming up, the projects I've got coming up are vastly different, you know, to the things we've been discussing, and that variation is what keeps you interested and stimulated, and you know, you never get bored because you can't. You've got to keep coming up with completely different ideas for completely different projects.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. I mean, it's great to have a versatile, or let's say it's great to be able to work on so many different projects, to be versatile and to switch gears, you know, work on different projects, action movies, comedies, animation. So it's pretty great, a great thing to have. And of course, we will talk about those projects when they are to be released. And thanks again for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to your new scores and to the movies, of course. And I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Take care. Bye, Henry.